Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Instead of diving into the usual parade of dysfunctional monarchs and their catastrophically inbred offspring, we're going to slow things way down. Like, way down. We're talking about Greek island villages, where the most dramatic thing that happened all week was someone's goat eating someone else's laundry. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a glass of water or whatever helps you drift off, because we're about to spend the next hour and a half exploring the absolutely glacial pace of life in traditional Greek island communities. No wars, no plagues, no Habsburg jaws, just islands and people living on them very, very slowly. Now, when we talk about Greek islands, most people think of Mykonos or Santorini, those Instagram famous spots where you pay 17 euros for a tiny coffee and fight through crowds of influencers trying to get the perfect sunset shot. But that's not what we're talking about tonight. We're going to the islands that tourism kind of forgot, or at least only remembers occasionally. The places where the population might be 200 people in winter and maybe 400 in summer when everyone's cousins come back from Athens. Islands where the taverna is also the post office, the mayor's house, and the place where Yaya Maria sells her embroidery on Thursdays. Let's start with the basics of what daily life actually looked like in these places, say, from the 1920s through the 1980s, before satellite TV and regular ferry service changed everything. Because for most of modern history, if you lived on a small Greek island, you were living in what was essentially a time capsule, a very slow, very sunny time capsule that smelled like oregano and salt water. The day started early because of course it did. Not because anyone was particularly ambitious, but because the Mediterranean sun is an absolute tyrant that doesn't care about your sleep schedule. By 5 in the morning, you'd hear the roosters, which were honestly just showing off at that point. Then the goats would start making their opinions known. Goats always have opinions. They're like the angry commenters of the animal kingdom, except they actually contribute to the economy by providing milk and cheese. The men would typically head out around dawn, some to their fishing boats, because fishing was one of the main ways people didn't starve. Others to their small plots of land, where they'd tend olive trees that were probably older than their great-grandparents. These olive trees had seen empires rise and fall. The Byzantines, the Venetians, the Ottomans, the modern Greek state, and the trees were just there like, cool. Anyway, here are some more olives. The trees didn't care about your political drama. They had photosynthesis to do. Fishing, though. Let's talk about fishing for a minute, because it dominated life on these islands in a way that's hard to overstate. These weren't industrial fishing operations with sonar and GPS. This was a guy named Demetrius in a wooden boat that his grandfather built, heading out before sunrise with nets that his wife had mended 17 times. He'd go to the same spots his father went to, using landmarks and gut feeling instead of charts. See that rock that looks vaguely like a worried turtle? 300 meters west of that is where the sardines hang out on Tuesdays. The catch was never guaranteed, which meant every single day had this low-level anxiety baked into it. Would there be fish? Would the weather hold? Would the nets break again? This wasn't exciting anxiety, mind you. This was the slow, grinding kind of worry that just became part of your baseline existence. Like elevator music, but for stress. While the men were out doing their thing with the fish and olives, the women were running literally everything else. And I mean everything. They were up even earlier than the men, usually around 4 or 4:30, because the bread wasn't going to make itself. Most households bake their own bread daily, not because they were artisanal foodies ahead of their time, but because that's just what you did. The communal oven would get fired up, and you'd see a parade of women carrying their risen dough on wooden boards balanced on their heads, walking to the village oven like it was the most normal thing in the world, which for them, it absolutely was. After the bread situation was handled, there were about 8,000 other tasks waiting. Laundry, which was done by hand. Cooking, which involved basically starting from scratch every single time because refrigeration was either non-existent or extremely unreliable. Tending the kitchen garden, where tomatoes, herbs, and whatever vegetables could handle the climate grew in soil that was probably 60% rock. Feeding the chickens, who were not grateful. Chickens are never grateful. Taking care of children, who were numerous because birth control was not really a thing, and the Orthodox Church had some very firm opinions about family planning. Oh, and also making almost everything the household needed that couldn't be bought, which was most things. Women wove cloth, embroidered, made lace, preserved food, churned butter, made cheese, and generally performed the kind of domestic labor that would make a modern home economist weep. All of this while wearing black, because someone was always in mourning. Your uncle died 2 years ago, still wearing black. Your cousin's husband's mother passed, black. The neighbor's goat died. Okay, maybe not for the goat, but you get the idea. Black was practical anyway. Hid the dirt. The pace of all this work was steady, but never rushed. There was no point rushing, really. Where were you going to go? The island was 12 square kilometers. You'd run out of island pretty quickly. Everything happened in its own time, dictated by the sun, the seasons, the church calendar, and the inexorable reality that some tasks just take as long as they take. Bread rises at its own pace. You can't hurry bread. Cheese ages when it's ready. The grapes ripen when they ripen, not when you'd prefer them to. This meant that people developed this very particular relationship with time that's almost alien to anyone used to modern life. Time wasn't something you saved or spent. It wasn't a resource to be optimized. It was just there, happening. Ice. You moved through it like you moved through the landscape. Some days were longer, some shorter, but fundamentally, tomorrow would be pretty much like today, which was pretty much like yesterday. Let's drift over to the social structure of these villages, because it's important for understanding why everything moved at the speed of a sedated tortoise. These were tight-knit communities, and I mean tight-knit in the way that everyone knew everything about everyone, going back at least 4 generations. Privacy was not a concept. Your business was everyone's business. Their business was your business, and the local yayas sitting outside their houses in the late afternoon were basically a human surveillance network that the Stasi would have envied. Every village had its hierarchy, which was mostly informal, but absolutely rigid. At the top, you had the old families, the ones who'd been on the island since God knows when. They owned most of the land, or at least the best land. Below them were everyone else, arranged in a complex social matrix based on factors like wealth, number of sons, quality of their olive trees, how many dowries they'd successfully negotiated, and whether anyone in their family had done something embarrassing recently. The priest was important, obviously. The Orthodox Church was woven into every aspect of life. Not just Sunday liturgy, though that was a whole thing that could easily eat up 4 hours of your weekend. The church calendar dictated when you fasted, and you fasted a lot. Wednesdays, Fridays, the entire 40 days before Easter, other random periods that the church had designated for spiritual reflection and general food misery. This meant a huge chunk of the year was spent not eating meat, dairy, or anything fun, basically surviving on beans, vegetables, bread, and an increasingly desperate longing for cheese. Every major life event went through the church. Baptisms, which were huge social occasions where basically the entire village showed up. Weddings, which were even bigger and involved days of preparation, ritual, food, dancing, and the kind of family drama that could sustain gossip for months. Funerals, which were appropriately solemn, but also extremely well attended because, again, nothing else was happening, and you had to maintain your social standing by showing up. The village also had its characters. Every single village had the same cast, like they were all working from the same template. There was the guy who'd been to Athens once and wouldn't shut up about it. The widow who made the best hilopits and knew it. The old man who sat in the Kafeneio all day, nursing a single coffee and commenting on everyone who walked by. The woman who was rumored to have the evil eye and who everyone avoided but also secretly consulted when they needed a curse removed. The family that kept getting in feuds with other families over things that happened in 1847. Speaking of feuds, let's talk about those for a second, because they were a major source of what passed for excitement in these places. Families would get into disputes over land boundaries, water rights, dowries, insults, real or perceived, or literally anything else you can imagine. These feuds could last for generations. Your great-grandfather insulted my great-grandfather's donkey. Therefore, our families don't speak, except at church, and weddings, and funerals, and the taverna. Okay, so they still interacted constantly because the island was tiny, but they did it while maintaining a very frosty demeanor. The Kafeneio deserves its own section because it was basically the social heart of village life, at least for the men. The Kafeneio was the coffee house, though calling it just a coffee house undersells it. It was the news station, the debate hall, the social club, the place where deals were made, marriages arranged, gossip traded, and political opinions loudly expressed to an audience of people who'd heard the exact same opinions yesterday. Men would gather there in the late afternoon and evening. After the day's work was done, they'd order Greek coffee, which came in tiny cups and was strong enough to wake the dead, or ouzo, or both. They'd play tavli, which is backgammon, and the sound of the dice hitting the wooden boards was basically the soundtrack of village life. They argue about politics with the kind of passion usually reserved for life or death situations, even though none of them had any power to change anything, and they all knew it. The conversations in the Kafeneio moved slowly, circling around the same topics. The weather, because it determined everything. The harvest, how it compared to last year's, whether old Stavros's olives looked healthy. National politics, which everyone had opinions about despite being geographically and practically removed from Athens. The latest village gossip, discussed with the solemnity of international diplomacy. Who was sick, who'd gotten engaged, whose son was doing well in Athens, whose daughter's marriage was rumored to be rocky. Women had their own social networks, usually centered around churches, wells, and each other's homes. They'd gather to do collective work, like preparing for festivals, or helping with someone's weaving project. The conversations were similar to the men's Kafeneio talks, but with better intel, honestly. The women knew everything. They knew who was pregnant before the woman herself sometimes knew. They knew which marriages were happy and which ones were held together by social obligation and sheer stubbornness. They knew exactly how much money each family had, where it came from, and how they spent it. Let me paint you a picture of a typical afternoon, say, sometime in the 1950s. It's August, so it's absolutely scorching. Everyone who has any sense is inside during the hottest part of the day, shutters closed against the sun. The village is quiet except for the cicadas, which are screaming their tiny insect heads off in the olive trees. Nothing moves except maybe a donkey standing in whatever shade it can find, looking philosophical about the heat. Around 4 or 5, when the temperature drops from surface of the sun to merely inside of an oven, people start emerging. The old women come out and sit on chairs outside their houses, doing handwork or just watching the street. The children, who have somehow survived another day without killing themselves despite the complete absence of adult supervision, start playing in the streets. Their games haven't changed in centuries. Tag, hide and seek, making up elaborate imaginary scenarios with whatever random objects they can find. The men drift toward the Kafeneio. The younger women start preparing the evening meal, which will be simple, but take hours because everything is done from scratch. Older women might walk to church to light a candle or say a prayer. A few people tend their gardens in the cooler evening air. Someone's goat has escaped again and is eating someone else's herbs, which will be discussed at length tomorrow. This is it. This is the excitement. And it will be exactly the same tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Now, let's float over to how the calendar shaped life in these island villages, because time wasn't just measured in days and weeks. It was measured in festivals, saints' days, and agricultural cycles that had been happening the same way for so long that nobody even remembered when they started. The Greek Orthodox Church has a saint for literally every single day of the year, sometimes multiple saints. And while you couldn't possibly celebrate all of them without doing anything else ever, certain saints' days were a big deal. If your village church was dedicated to St. George, then April 23rd was basically your village's birthday party. If you were named after a saint, your name day was more important than your actual birthday. Nobody really cared when you were born, but the feast day of your patron saint, that was when you had to provide hospitality to basically everyone who showed up at your house. The big festivals punctuated the year like chapter breaks in a very long, very slow book. Easter was the absolute biggest deal in the Orthodox calendar, not Christmas. Christmas was nice, sure, but Easter was when things got serious. The preparation started weeks in advance with Great Lent, those 40 days of fasting where you slowly went insane from lack of cheese while trying to be spiritually pure. Holy Week was intense in a way that's hard to convey. Every day had its specific observances. People attended church services that went on for hours. On Good Friday, the whole village would participate in the Epitaphius procession, where they'd carry a flower-covered bier representing Christ's tomb through the streets while singing hymns that were specifically designed to make you feel the weight of mortality and sin. It was somber. It was beautiful. It was also kind of exhausting. Then Saturday night rolled around, and everyone gathered at the church just before midnight for the resurrection service. The church would be packed, absolutely stuffed with people holding unlit candles. At midnight, the priest would emerge with the holy light, proclaiming Christos Anesti, Christ is risen, and suddenly everyone's candles were being lit from their neighbors, the light spreading through the crowd until the whole church glowed. Then people would carefully carry their lit candles home, trying to keep them from going out in the wind, because if you could get your candle home still burning, that was good luck. You'd use it to make the sign of the cross and smoke above your doorway. After that, the fasting was over and everyone descended on the food like they'd been lost in the desert for 40 days, which emotionally they kind of had been. Margaritza, that weird soup made from lamb organs that you either love or hate. Red-dyed eggs that you'd crack against other people's eggs in a competitive ritual. And then, on Easter Sunday, the lamb. Oh, the lamb. Every family that could afford it would roast a lamb on a spit, and the smell of roasting meat would just blanket the entire village. You'd eat, and eat, and eat some more, and then probably take a nap because your body had forgotten how to process animal protein. Christmas was quieter but still significant. The traditions were a bit different from what you might see in Western Europe or America. No Christmas trees, originally. That was a later import. Instead, you had the karavaki, these little wooden boats that kids would decorate because Greece is a maritime culture, and apparently even their Christmas decorations needed to be boat-themed. On Christmas Eve, children would go door to door singing the kalanta, these traditional carols, while banging on triangles or other noisemakers. People would give them coins or sweets, and the kids would accumulate a small fortune over the course of the day. The Christmas meal was important, usually featuring roasted pork or chicken, and there were special breads and sweets, but it didn't have quite the same frenzied energy as Easter. Then there was Apokris, the carnival season before Lent, which was basically everyone's last chance to eat meat and act ridiculous before the long slog of fasting began. People would dress up. There'd be music and dancing in the villages, and a general atmosphere of we're all about to be very hungry and virtuous. So let's get this out of our systems now. August 15th. The Dormition of the Theotokos, that's the Virgin Mary's feast day, was huge, especially in villages with churches dedicated to her. People would come from all over, including family members who'd moved away. There'd be a festival, a panegyric, with food, music, and dancing that would go until dawn. The church service itself could last 3 or 4 hours, with everyone standing because pews weren't really a thing in Orthodox churches. You stood, you endured, you proved your devotion through your aching legs. Beyond the religious calendar, the agricultural calendar dictated everything. The olive harvest in late fall and early winter was a major event that required everyone's participation. Families would spread nets under their olive trees and spend days knocking the olives down with long poles, then collecting them to take to the olive press. The pressing itself was a social occasion. You'd wait your turn at the press, gossiping with other families, and then you'd get your oil in large tins that would sustain you through the year. The grape harvest in September was similarly all-consuming. Every family with vines would pick their grapes, and then the process of making wine would begin. People would stomp the grapes in large barrels because mechanization was either unavailable or unaffordable. Children would help, thinking it was the best game ever, getting their legs all purple and sticky. The resulting wine was not fancy. It was not going to win awards. It was rough, strong, and absolutely essential to daily life. Wheat was harvested in early summer, And again, this was a communal effort. The threshing floor, the alani, was where the wheat would be separated from the chaff, usually by having donkeys or mules walk in circles over it. Then you'd wait for a windy day and toss the wheat into the air, letting the wind carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. It was simple, effective, and hadn't changed since ancient times. Why fix what isn't broken, even if not broken means back-breaking labor in the hot sun? Let's pause and think about what this meant for people's sense of time and existence. Your year wasn't divided into Kafeneio, Q2, or spring break, summer vacation. It was before the olive harvest, after the grape harvest, during Lent, after Easter, when we planted the wheat, when we threshed it. Events were remembered not by dates, but by their relationship to these markers. That was the year the big storm hit during the olive harvest, or that happened right after Easter. Remember, because we still had leftover lamb. This created a life that was deeply rhythmic and repetitive, which sounds boring from the outside but actually provided a kind of stability and meaning. You knew where you fit. You knew what was expected of you. You knew that if you did the same things your parents did and their parents did, you'd probably be okay. Not wealthy, not famous, not particularly special, but okay. You'd survive. Your children would survive. The olives would keep growing. There was a comfort in that predictability, even if it came at the cost of individual ambition or novelty. Nobody was reinventing themselves or having a midlife crisis where they quit their job to become a DJ. You were who you were, and you'd be that person until you died, at which point the village would give you a proper funeral and remember you as the one who was good with goats or the woman who made excellent dollmates. Social mobility was essentially non-existent, but that also meant social anxiety about status was limited. You weren't going to suddenly become rich and move up in the world, but you also weren't going to fall far unless you did something spectacularly stupid. You inherited your place in the village hierarchy, along with your family's land and reputation. For better or worse, you were stuck with it. The isolation of island life reinforced all of this. Ferries to the mainland were infrequent, expensive, and weather-dependent. If a storm hit, you might be cut off for days or weeks. This meant that the island was basically its own world. News from Athens or anywhere else arrived slowly, often garbled, and felt distant and irrelevant. Why care about political intrigue in the capital when you're more concerned about whether the goats are producing enough milk? People rarely left the island except for necessity. Military service for young men was mandatory, which meant they'd get their first real glimpse of the outside world. Some would come back changed, restless, full of ideas about how things could be different. Others would come back relieved to be home, convinced that island life was superior to whatever chaos they'd witnessed in the cities. Either way, they'd slip back into the village routine, because what else were you going to do? Women had even less opportunity to leave. A woman's world was circumscribed by her family's land, the village boundaries, the church, and the homes of relatives. The most exciting journey most women made was to another island or the mainland for a wedding or funeral. Some never left their island at all, living their entire lives within a radius of a few kilometers. Their world was small, but it was all they knew, and they made it work. Children grew up essentially feral, at least by modern standards. They weren't scheduled for activities or supervised constantly. They ran around in packs, explored the island, learned to swim by being thrown into the sea, and developed a kind of practical competence that came from having actual freedom and actual consequences. If you fell off a wall, you got hurt. If you annoyed the neighbor's dog, you got bitten. You learned. Education was basic and often inconsistent. The village school, if there was one, would have one teacher handling all the grades in a single room. The teacher was usually from somewhere else, sent to the island as a kind of professional exile. And they may or may not have been enthusiastic about teaching a bunch of kids whose parents didn't particularly value formal education beyond basic literacy and math. The really ambitious families might send a son to a school on a larger island or the mainland, but that required money and the willingness to be separated from your child for months at a time. Most kids learned what they needed to know from their families. Boys learned farming, fishing, and building from their fathers and uncles. Girls learned cooking, weaving, childcare, and household management from their mothers and grandmothers. These skills were transmitted through observation and participation, not formal instruction. You learned to mend nets by watching and then doing. You learned to bake bread by helping and eventually taking over. You learned which plants were edible and which would kill you by being taught, and occasionally through trial and error, hopefully, with the non-lethal plants. So let's drift into the topic of marriage and family dynamics, because this is where island village life gets really interesting in a thank goodness I wasn't born there and then kind of way. Marriage wasn't about love. I mean, sure, sometimes people fell in love and got married, and that was a nice bonus, but it wasn't the point. Marriage was an economic and social arrangement between families. It was about consolidating land, forming alliances, ensuring financial stability, and perpetuating the family line. Romance was for foreigners and people in Athens who'd gotten weird ideas from movies. Matches were typically arranged by the families, with the young people involved having varying degrees of input, depending on how progressive or stubborn their parents were. The matchmaking process often involved a proxenatra, a matchmaker, usually an older woman with an encyclopedic knowledge of every eligible person on the island and the neighboring islands, plus detailed intel on their families' financial situations, health histories, and social standing going back 3 generations. The negotiations could take months. First, the families had to agree that a match was suitable. Then came the discussion of the dowry, which was the money, property, and goods that the bride's family would give to the new couple. The dowry was absolutely crucial. A woman without a decent dowry was basically unmarriageable, which meant families with daughters would save for years, even decades, to assemble enough to make their daughters attractive marriage prospects. The dowry might include land, a house, furniture, linens, money, olive trees, or really anything of value. The bride would also bring a trousseau of household items she'd been preparing since childhood: embroidered sheets, woven blankets, tablecloths, all made by hand during those endless hours of women sitting together doing handwork. Every stitch represented hours of labor and planning for a future that was decided long before the actual wedding. Once the terms were agreed upon, the engagement would be announced. This was a binding agreement. Breaking an engagement was a huge scandal that would damage both families' reputations. The engagement period might last months or even years, while final preparations were made and the necessary items were assembled. The wedding itself was a multi-day affair that basically bankrupted the bride's family, but was absolutely necessary for maintaining social standing. There were pre-wedding rituals, like the kravati, where the marriage bed would be made by unmarried girls who would roll a baby across it for fertility. Money would be pinned to the sheets by guests, because even your bedding was a social performance that required financial participation. The wedding ceremony was long and involved a lot of standing. The crowning, the stefana, where the bride and groom had crowns joined by a ribbon placed on their heads while they walked around the altar 3 times. The drinking of the common cup, the blessings that seemed to go on forever. Meanwhile, everyone in the village was packed into the church, judging the bride's dress, the quality of the stefana, whether the families looked appropriately solemn or too cheerful, and generally having opinions about everything. After the ceremony came the feast, which was where the bride's family really demonstrated their wealth and generosity. There would be mountains of food, because you couldn't have a wedding with stingy portions without bringing shame upon your entire lineage. Roasted meats, vegetables, bread, cheese, sweets, wine flowing freely. Musicians would play, and people would dance traditional dances in circles, holding hands, moving in steps that everyone had known since childhood. The celebration would go on for hours, often into the early morning. The bride and groom would eventually retire to their new home, which had ideally been prepared as part of the dowry arrangements. The next day, there might be more visiting and gift-giving. And then finally, everyone would go back to normal life, except now these 2 people were married and expected to produce children as soon as possible. The wedding night came with its own weird rituals and social pressures. In some villages, there was the deeply uncomfortable tradition of checking for proof of the bride's virginity, which was exactly as invasive and traumatic as it sounds. The stained sheet would be displayed to confirm that the bride had been a virgin and the marriage was consummated. This wasn't universal, but it happened enough that it's worth mentioning as part of the general horror show of historical marriage practices. Once married, the couple's roles were clearly defined. The husband was the public face of the family, the one who dealt with the outside world, attended the Kafeneio, made decisions about land and crops and money. The wife was in charge of the household, which was actually a huge domain of power, even if it didn't look like it from the outside. She controlled the food, the budget, the children's upbringing, and the social relationships with other families through the female networks. A good wife was industrious, pious, modest, fertile, and skilled in all the domestic arts. A good husband provided for his family, didn't gamble away the farm, wasn't abusive beyond whatever level of domestic violence was considered acceptable in that time and place, and preferably didn't embarrass the family with his behavior. The bar was not high. Children started arriving, ideally about 9 months after the wedding. If they didn't arrive, that was a problem. Infertility was usually blamed on the wife, because of course it was, even though the husband was just as likely to be the issue. A childless marriage was a tragedy and a scandal. The whole point was to have children, preferably sons who could work the land and inherit property, though daughters were necessary too, if only to eventually marry them off and form alliances with other families. Childbirth was dangerous. Women died in childbirth regularly, and there wasn't much that could be done about it. The village midwife would attend the birth using traditional methods that had been passed down for generations and which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. If there were complications, you prayed and hoped for the best. Medical care was limited to whatever the island had, which was usually not much. Infant mortality was high, It wasn't uncommon for families to lose several children before they reached adulthood. People didn't name babies immediately for this reason. You'd wait a bit, make sure the child was going to survive, and then have the baptism, which was when the child officially got their name and became a full person in the eyes of the church and society. The children who survived grew up in large multi-generational households. Grandparents, parents, children, sometimes unmarried aunts or uncles, all living together under one roof or in adjacent houses. Privacy, again, was not a thing. Everyone knew everyone else's business because you literally couldn't avoid it when you were all living on top of each other. Discipline was handled by whoever was nearby and felt like it. Your mother, your grandmother, your aunt, the neighbor who saw you doing something you shouldn't. It took a village to raise a child, not in the heartwarming, inspirational way, but in the everyone feels entitled to smack you if you misbehave way. Family loyalty was paramount. Your family was your identity, your security, your social safety net. If you got in trouble, your family would help you, even if they were mad at you. If someone outside the family wronged you, your family would back you up, even if you'd been in the wrong. Blood was everything. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, and marrying someone from off the island was considered vaguely risky, like you were importing unknown variables into the carefully balanced social ecosystem. The elderly were cared for by their families. There were no nursing homes, no retirement communities. When you got old, you lived with your children, usually your son, and you helped out as much as you could until you couldn't anymore, and then you waited to die while the family took care of you. Some elderly people were revered for their wisdom and experience. Others were just kind of there, a burden that the family bore, because that's what you did. Death was handled by the community. When someone died, the body would be washed and prepared by family members dressed in their best clothes and laid out in the house for people to come pay their respects. The funeral would be within a day or two because, no refrigeration and Mediterranean heat. Everyone would attend, everyone would cry, and then there'd be a memorial meal where you'd eat and talk about the deceased. But the mourning didn't end there. For widows especially, mourning was a permanent state. You'd wear black for the rest of your life. You'd limit your social activities. You'd be expected to be appropriately sorrowful and devoted to your dead husband's memory, even if you'd hated him and were secretly relieved he was gone. The social performance of grief was mandatory and ongoing. There were also exhumations, which is a fun detail. After 3 years or so, the body would be dug up, the bones cleaned, and placed in an ossuary, and the grave could be reused. This was practical because space in the cemetery was limited, but it also meant you had this ritual of literally digging up your dead relatives and handling their bones while saying prayers. Just another cheerful aspect of island life. Family feuds, as I mentioned earlier, were a constant background hum. Some families just didn't get along, and this could go on for so long that nobody even remembered the original cause. We don't talk to the Papabopoulos family. Why not? I don't know. Ask your grandmother. And your grandmother would tell you some story about a broken engagement in 1892 and a disputed property line. And you'd realize you were inheriting beef that predated your existence by decades. These feuds would occasionally flare up into actual conflicts. Shouting matches in the street, legal battles over land, passive-aggressive behavior at church, strategic alliance building through marriages designed to strengthen one faction against another. It was like Game of Thrones, but with more olive oil and fewer dragons. Despite all this drama, or maybe because of it, there was a strong sense of community. When disaster struck, a fire, a storm, a failed harvest, people helped each other. They might not like each other, they might be feuding, but they'd still show up with food or labor or whatever was needed. Because at the end of the day, you were all stuck on this island together, and if your neighbor's house burned down, that was a problem for everyone. Let's float over now to the practical economics of how people actually survived on these islands, because it wasn't like anyone was getting rich. This was subsistence, living with occasional small surpluses that could be sold or traded. Most families owned small plots of land, maybe a few olive trees, a tiny vineyard, a garden plot. This land had been in the family for generations, divided and subdivided through inheritance until everybody owned these fragmented little pieces scattered around the island. You might have one plot on a hillside good for olives, another plot near the village for vegetables, and a third plot somewhere else that was basically just rocks, but had been in the family since your great-great-grandfather won it in a card game or something. The olive trees were the most valuable assets. A mature olive tree could produce for centuries and required relatively little maintenance. Yes, you had to prune them and eventually harvest the olives, but mostly they just sat there being trees and slowly making you less poor. The oil from these trees was used for everything: cooking, lamps, medicine, sold or traded for things you couldn't produce yourself. The grapes were important too, both for eating and for wine. The wine, as mentioned, was rough stuff, but it was yours, and it was free except for the labor, and it made the daily grind of existence slightly more bearable. People drank wine with their meals, watered down usually, because the water quality was sometimes questionable, and alcohol killed bacteria. The kids drank it too, very watered down. Nobody thought this was weird. Vegetables were grown in small gardens: tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, beans, greens, onions, garlic, herbs. These gardens required constant attention because the soil was often poor, water was scarce, and everything from goats to insects wanted to eat your crops before you could. Women did most of this work, coaxing food out of reluctant earth through sheer stubborn effort. Chickens provided eggs and occasionally meat when they stopped laying. Goats provided milk that was made into cheese and yogurt. A pig, if you could afford to keep one, would be slaughtered before Christmas and provide meat, fat for cooking, and raw materials for sausages that could be preserved. Every part of the animal was used because wasting food was unthinkable. Fish was protein when you could get it. The fishermen would bring back their catches and sell or trade what they didn't need for their own families. The fish would be eaten fresh, or preserved in salt, or dried in the sun. Nothing fancy, just calories from the sea converted into the energy needed to get through another day. Bread was the absolute staple, the foundation of every meal. When people said, "Give us this day our daily bread," they meant it literally. You ate bread with everything: bread and olives, bread and cheese, bread and vegetables, bread dipped in oil, bread soaked in wine. If you had bread, you wouldn't starve. If you didn't have bread, you were in serious trouble. The grain for bread was either grown by your family if you had suitable land, or bought or traded for. Making bread was a daily task that took hours. You'd start with a piece of dough saved from the previous batch as a starter. You'd mix it with flour, water, salt, and maybe a bit of olive oil. You'd knead it until your arms hurt. You'd let it rise, punch it down, shape it into loaves, let it rise again, and then carry it to the communal oven to be baked. The communal oven was a social hub. Women would gather there, waiting for their bread to bake, gossiping, helping each other, judging each other's bread quality. If your bread came out dense and sad, everyone would know and would have opinions. If your bread was perfect, you'd earned bragging rights until next time. Food preservation was essential because you couldn't just go to a grocery store. Things had to last. Vegetables were preserved in olive oil, pickled in brine, or sun-dried. Fruits were made into preserves or dried. Meat was salted, cured, smoked. Cheese was aged in caves or buried in salt. Every household had its store of preserved foods, carefully rationed to last from one harvest season to the next. Cooking was done over an open fire or a simple wood-burning stove. Temperature control was an art form learned through experience. You couldn't just turn a dial. You had to know how much wood to use, how to arrange the coals, how to judge the heat by holding your hand over the fire and seeing how quickly it became uncomfortable. Meals were simple and repetitive. Breakfast might be bread with olive oil and olives, maybe some cheese, definitely coffee, or mountain tea. Lunch, the main meal, would be something like beans or lentils stewed with vegetables and olive oil, served with bread. Dinner was lighter, maybe leftover bread soaked in wine with some tomatoes, and feta crumbled on top. Meat was a luxury for special occasions, not daily fare. During fasting periods, which again was a huge chunk of the calendar, even the cheese and eggs were off limits. You'd be eating mostly beans, vegetables, bread, and olives, getting increasingly cranky and spiritually pure. The day you could eat dairy again was a celebration. Water was a constant concern. Islands don't have rivers. Water came from wells, springs, or cisterns that collected rainwater. Every drop was precious, especially in summer when it didn't rain for months. Women would walk to the well multiple times a day, carrying heavy jugs of water on their heads or shoulders because plumbing was either non-existent or extremely basic. Washing was minimal by modern standards. You didn't take daily showers because the water and fuel to heat it were too precious. You do spot cleaning as needed, and every few weeks there'd be a more thorough washing, usually in heated water in a large basin. Laundry was a major production done once a week or so, involving hauling water, heating it, scrubbing clothes by hand, rinsing them, and hanging them to dry. Everything took forever. Making a meal, doing laundry, maintaining clothes, caring for animals, tending crops, all of these tasks that we now accomplish in minutes or hours used to take huge portions of the day. There was no such thing as convenience. Everything required physical labor, time, and knowledge. Money was relatively scarce. Most economic activity was based on subsistence production and informal barter. You'd trade your excess olive oil for someone else's wheat, or exchange cheese for fish, or provide labor in return for the loan of a donkey. Actual cash transactions were less common and usually involved larger purchases or sales to merchants who came to the island. The few sources of cash income were fishing, selling catch to merchants, selling agricultural surpluses if you had them, remittances from family members who'd migrated to cities or abroad for work, and occasionally tourism once that started becoming a thing in the mid-20th century. But mostly, people got by on what they could produce themselves, supplemented by a complex web of exchange and reciprocal obligations with their neighbors. Debt was serious. If you borrowed money or goods, you were expected to pay it back, and if you couldn't, that was a stain on your family's honor. Loan sharks existed even in these small communities, preying on desperate people who needed money for dowries or emergencies. The interest rates could be crushing, trapping families in cycles of debt that lasted generations. There were no social safety nets. If your crops failed, if you got sick and couldn't work, if your boat sank, if your house burned down, you depended on your family and the grudging charity of your community. The church provided some assistance to the truly destitute, but mostly you were on your own, which made people simultaneously more resilient and more vulnerable. The grinding poverty of this existence is hard to overstate. People weren't starving usually, but they were 1 or 2 bad breaks away from disaster at all times. A drought, a plague of locusts, a illness or injury that took out the primary breadwinner. Any of these could tip a family from barely getting by to genuine crisis. And yet, people persevered. They worked their land, raised their children, observed their traditions, and got through each day, knowing that tomorrow would be much the same. There was a kind of dignity in that persistence, even if it was born more from lack of alternatives than from choice. So as the sun starts to set on our exploration of Greek island village life, let's spend some time on the evenings and nights, because that's when the pace of life slowed from lazy tortoise to tortoise contemplating whether it's worth moving at all. Evening in the village began when the heat finally broke, usually around 7 or 8. The quality of light would change, going from harsh white to golden to that particular Mediterranean blue hour that makes everything look like a postcard. People would finish their day's work and drift into the evening routines that had been practiced for generations. For the men, this meant heading to the Kafeneio, if they hadn't already. Evening was prime Kafeneio time. They'd settle in with their coffee or ouzo, pull out the tavli boards, and commence the serious business of passing time. The conversations would meander through familiar topics, the same political arguments they'd had yesterday, observations about whose boat needed repairs, speculation about whether it would rain soon, commentary on any slightly unusual event that had happened in the village. The pace of these conversations was glacial. Someone would make a statement. There'd be a long pause while someone else contemplated this. Then a response, not necessarily directly related to the original statement. Another pause. Maybe someone would shake the dice for tavli, think about their move for an extended period, make it, and then look up as if surprised that conversation had been happening. It was social interaction as a form of ambient companionship rather than active engagement. Meanwhile, the women would be in and around their homes, cleaning up from the evening meal, doing handwork, supervising children who still had energy somehow despite the heat and the day's activities. Groups of women might sit together outside, knitting or embroidering or just talking. Their conversations were more animated than the men's, full of actual news and information exchange, but still moved at that particular pace that came from having nowhere else to be and nothing pressing to do. Children would play in the streets and alleys as darkness fell, inventing games, telling stories they'd heard from their grandparents, occasionally getting into minor mischief that would be discovered and discussed the next day. There were no street lights in most villages until quite late in the 20th century, so as it got darker, the children would gradually get called inside, their voices fading until the village was quiet except for the adults and the cicadas. The evening meal had already been eaten, usually around sunset. It was lighter than lunch because people were winding down, not needing heavy fuel for labor. Leftovers from lunch, bread, maybe some fruit if it was in season, cheese if you weren't fasting. Families would eat together, though together was a loose term since the men might have already eaten at the Kafeneio or might be planning to eat later with their friends. After the meal came the slow progression towards sleep, which wasn't a thing you rushed. There was no television until quite recently, no radio in many houses, nothing to mark the time except the gradual deepening of darkness and the body's natural rhythms. People would sit outside if the weather was nice, enjoying the cooler air, looking at the stars, listening to the sea, if the village was coastal. The stars were incredible, by the way. No light pollution, crystal clear air, and you could see the Milky Way like a river of light across the sky. People knew the constellations, used them for navigation if they were sailors, told stories about them, recognized the changing sky as the seasons turn. The night sky was like a familiar friend that you checked in with every evening. There might be music on special occasions. Someone had a lyra or a laudo, traditional instruments, and they'd play the old songs that everyone knew. People might dance, those same circle dances they do at weddings and festivals, moving slowly in the dark, holding hands, continuing traditions that went back to before anyone could remember. But most nights, there was no music, just quiet. Ghost stories and folklore would be shared, especially to entertain the children. Every village had its stories of spirits and strange occurrences. The Vrykolakas, the Greek vampire, the Kalakanzaroi, mischievous goblin-like creatures, stories of saints and miracles, tales of heroic deeds from the War of Independence. These stories were part of the culture, passed down orally, changing slightly with each telling but maintaining their essential shape. The old people were the repositories of these stories, and they'd share them on these slow evenings, their voices carrying in the dark, painting pictures of a past that blended seamlessly into myth. History and legend weren't clearly separated. Your grandfather's story about fighting the Turks would slide into a story about a saint appearing to someone in a dream, and then into a folk tale about a magical fish. And it all had the same weight of truth because it was all part of the shared narrative. As night deepened, people would gradually retire. Bedtime wasn't standardized. You went to bed when you were tired, which was usually pretty early since you'd been up since before dawn and had done physical labor all day. The houses didn't have much in the way of lighting. Maybe an oil lamp or candles, but these were used sparingly because oil and wax cost money. So when it got dark, it got really dark, and there wasn't much point in staying up. Beds were simple, usually a mattress stuffed with wool or straw, placed on a wooden frame, or sometimes just on the floor. Multiple people might share a bed, especially children. Privacy again, not really a thing. You'd sleep in your undergarments or a simple nightshirt, under blankets in winter or just a sheet in summer, when even that felt like too much covering. The nights were quiet, but not silent. You'd hear the sea if you were near the coast, a constant rhythmic presence. The wind in the olive trees making them rustle and sigh. Dogs barking in the distance, having important dog conversations about territory and food. Sometimes a donkey would bray, the sound carrying across the village and making you wonder what existential crisis had prompted it. Roosters, of course, announcing the passage of time with unnecessary enthusiasm starting around 3 a.m. In summer, the heat was oppressive even at night. Windows would be open, shutters adjusted to catch any breeze while blocking the worst of the sun during the day. You lie there sweating, drifting in and out of sleep, waiting for the marginally cooler pre-dawn hours. In winter, you'd pile on blankets and huddle for warmth, because heating a house required fuel, and fuel was expensive, and you didn't waste it on making the bedroom comfortable when you could just use more blankets. Dreams in these villages, one imagines, were probably pretty mundane. You dream about your daily life because that's what filled your mind. The goats, the olive trees, the bread that didn't rise properly, the argument with your neighbor, the upcoming festival. Maybe sometimes you'd have stranger dreams, anxiety dreams about failing harvests or losing your way, or pleasant dreams about abundance and celebration. But mostly, your subconscious was probably just processing the same slow, repetitive patterns of your waking life. Nightmares would be about real fears: sickness, death, poverty, social disgrace, storms, fires. The things that could actually destroy your life and that you had limited power to prevent. You'd wake up in the dark, heart pounding, and lie there listening to the breathing of your family members around you, reminding yourself that for now, everyone was safe. The house was still standing. Tomorrow was just another day like today. Some people couldn't sleep. The elderly, especially, would lie awake for hours, their bodies aching, their minds circling through memories and worries. They'd hear every sound in the night, track the progress of time by the changing patterns of sound and silence. In the morning, they'd be tired, but would get up anyway because what else were you going to do? Babies would wake and cry, needing to be fed or changed or just comforted. New mothers existed in a fog of exhaustion, responding to their infants mechanically while longing for uninterrupted sleep they wouldn't get for months or years. Older children would help with the baby sometimes, getting training in childcare whether they wanted it or not. Sick people would suffer through the night because nighttime made everything worse. Pain was worse. Fever was worse. Fear was worse. You'd pray to the saint whose icon hung in the corner, making bargains with God and the saints. If you just made it through this night, you'd light a candle, make an offering, be more pious, something. And if you did make it through, you'd keep your bargain, because you might need divine intervention again. Sometimes people would die in the night. It was considered a peaceful time to die in your sleep, surrounded by family, even if they were also asleep. Better than dying in daylight when there was work to be done. The family would wake to find their loved one had passed, and the ritual of death would begin. The washing, the dressing, the grieving, the funeral preparations, the whole community-wide process of dealing with mortality. But most nights, nothing dramatic happened. People slept, woke, slept again, dreamed forgettable dreams, and eventually the sky would start to lighten. The roosters would start their absurd crowing. Another day would begin, identical to the last one, and the whole slow cycle would repeat. The rhythm of this life was so deeply ingrained that people didn't question it. You woke with the sun, worked through the day, rested in the evening, slept when it was dark. The seasons turned. The festivals came and went. You got older. Your children grew up and had children of their own, and the pattern continued. It was both comforting and suffocating, depending on your personality and circumstances. For some, this life was everything they wanted: safety, stability, community, a clear role, and purpose. For others, it was a cage. But whether you loved it or hated it, it was the life you had. And for most people in these villages, for most of history, leaving wasn't really an option. So you made your peace with it. You found meaning in the small things. A successful harvest, a good meal, your child's laughter, the beauty of the sunset, the solidarity of community in hard times. And at night, after another long day of essentially the same tasks you'd done yesterday and would do tomorrow, you'd lie down in your simple bed, listen to the familiar sounds of your island home, and drift off to sleep, knowing that when you woke, the world would be exactly as you left it. Let's drift now into how the changing seasons shaped this slow existence. Because while every day was similar, the year did have its own gentle rhythm, marked more by nature and tradition than by any modern calendar. Spring on the Greek islands was a relatively brief explosion of green and flowers. After the winter rains, the landscape would transform from brown and gray to vibrant with wildflowers, herbs, and new growth. This was when the world felt alive and generous. The bees would be busy, people would harvest honey, and there was a sense of renewal that the church calendar captured with the preparations for Easter. But spring was also work. This was planting season for vegetables, time to prune and care for the vines and trees, time to prepare for the long, hot summer ahead. Lambs would be born, which meant more shepherding work, but also the promise of future food. The sea would calm after winter storms, and fishing could resume in earnest. The weather was unpredictable. One day would be perfect, mild and sunny, and the next a storm would blow through, reminding everyone that nature was still in charge. You couldn't control the weather. You could only react to it. If rain came during a crucial time, you adjusted. If drought set in early, you worried and prayed and rationed water more carefully. Summer was the dominant season, the one that defined island life. It lasted from May until October, essentially half the year, and it was characterized by heat, drought, and intense light. The landscape would turn golden and brown as vegetation dried out. The heat in July and August was brutal, turning the middle of the day into a time when nothing moved except tourists who didn't know better. This was the season of fasting before the dormition of the Theotokos in August, which meant you were hot and hungry at the same time. The combination made people irritable, but everyone was irritable together, so at least it was communal suffering. You'd fast, complain about fasting, and then break the fast on August 15th with the kind of eating that suggested you'd personally ended a famine. The August 15th panegyric was one of the highlights of the year. Family members who'd left for work in Athens or abroad would come back for the feast. The village population would swell. There'd be special services at church, and then the secular celebration. Food, wine, music, dancing, socializing that went on until dawn. This was when you caught up with relatives you hadn't seen in months, when you showed off how well you were doing, or pretended to, when marriages might be discussed and alliances formed. The dancing at these festivals was a sight. Everyone knew the same dances, had been doing them since childhood. The men would start, forming a line or circle, and they'd dance with this serious concentration, like they were performing a ritual rather than having fun. The women would watch and comment. Eventually, the women would dance too, sometimes separately, sometimes mixed with the men as the night went on and the wine flowed. The music was live, played on traditional instruments. The sound would carry across the village, drawing people from their homes. Even the elderly who couldn't dance anymore would come to watch and remember when they could. Children would mimic the adults, learning the steps naturally through observation and participation. This was cultural transmission in its purest form. Summer was also harvest season. The wheat in June, threshing in the heat while dust got into absolutely everything. The grapes in September, picked and processed into wine. These harvests required all hands, and during these periods, the usual rhythm of life would be disrupted by intense collective labor. Families would help each other. Neighbors would cooperate, and there'd be a sense of urgency that was unusual for island life. As autumn approached and the worst heat finally broke, there was a sense of relief. The weather became pleasant again. The first rains would come, and people would celebrate water falling from the sky after months of drought. The landscape would start to green up a bit. This was when you started preparing for winter, even though winter on a Mediterranean island was nothing like winter in northern climates. October and November were olive season. This was crucial economically, since olive oil was such a staple. Families would spread nets under their trees and harvest the olives, either by hand or by hitting the branches with long poles and collecting what fell. It was hard work, but social, multiple generations working together, sharing meals in the olive groves, telling stories during breaks. The olive pressing was a communal event. Most villages had a shared press, and families would take turns bringing their harvested olives. You'd wait your turn, which could take hours, and this waiting time was social time. People would talk, catch up on gossip, do business, arrange things. When your turn came, you'd watch the press work, the olives being crushed, and the oil flowing out, golden and fresh. This oil would sustain your family for the year. It was liquid gold, quite literally. Winter was mild by most standards, but still brought changes. The days were shorter, the sun weaker. Rain was more frequent, which was good for the land, but could make life uncomfortable in houses that weren't well heated or waterproof. The seas were rough, making fishing dangerous or impossible on stormy days. This was when people stayed closer to home, when social life contracted. Christmas preparations began in December. Women would make special breads and sweets. The house would be cleaned thoroughly. Children would practice their kalanta, those carols they'd sing door to door on Christmas Eve. On Christmas Day, the church service would be attended by basically everyone, and then families would gather for the holiday meal. New Year's was also significant. The tradition of the vasilopita, the New Year's cake with a coin hidden inside, meant everyone would gather to cut the cake and see who got good luck for the year. The person who found the coin would indeed have good luck, mainly in the form of everyone being jealous of them. January and February were the dead months. Not much happened. The weather could be unpredictable, with occasional cold spells or storms. People hunkered down, maintained their equipment, did indoor work like repairs and weaving. The days were short, darkness came early, and there was a quality of waiting for spring, waiting for the year to truly begin again. Carnival season, apocryphs, would arrive before Lent, giving everyone a chance to eat meat and celebrate before the next long fasting period. There'd be masquerades and parties, a final burst of indulgence before 40 days of restraint. Children would dress up, people would play pranks, and there'd be a general atmosphere of controlled chaos. And then Lent would begin, and you'd be back to fasting and spiritual discipline and the year would roll toward Easter again. The whole cycle would repeat endlessly, each year essentially the same as the last, with only minor variations. The landmarks were always the same: Easter, the August feast, olive harvest, Christmas, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. People marked their lives by these cycles. That happened the year of the big Easter feast when it rained. That was 3 olive harvests after the storm damaged the church. Time wasn't linear so much as circular, always coming back to the same points, the same celebrations, the same tasks. Births, marriages, and deaths punctuated this cycle, but didn't break it. A baby would be born, baptized at the next available opportunity, grow up through all these festivals and harvests, eventually marry at Easter or summer, when weddings were traditional, have their own children who'd experience the exact same cycle, and eventually die and be buried while the festivals and harvests continued. There was something deeply fatalistic about this worldview. You were part of a pattern that was bigger than you, older than you, and would continue after you were gone. Your individual life mattered to you and your family, but was ultimately just one more iteration of a pattern that had been repeating for longer than anyone could remember. This could be comforting or depressing, depending on your perspective and circumstances. If your life was reasonably good, the predictability was reassuring. You knew what to expect. You knew your place. You knew that as long as you followed the pattern, things would probably be okay. If your life was difficult or you were unhappy, the endless repetition could feel like a trap, knowing that nothing would ever really change, that you'd be doing these same things until you died. And now, as we reach the gentle conclusion of our very long, very slow tour through Greek island village life, let's just kind of float here for a while in the timeless quality of this existence, because that's really what defined it most, the sense that time moved differently, or barely moved at all. These villages existed in a kind of suspended animation for centuries. The technology changed very slowly. The social structures changed even more slowly. The patterns of life that someone experienced in 1850 wouldn't have been dramatically different from what someone experienced in 1750 or even 1650. Sure, there were political changes, different empires ruled, borders shifted, Greece became independent, but at the village level, life continued in much the same way, regardless of who was nominally in charge. The isolation contributed to this timelessness. When it takes a day or more to get to the nearest city, when news arrives weeks late and distorted, when your world is literally the visible horizon of your small island, change happens slowly. New ideas filtered in gradually, if at all. New technologies arrived years or decades after they'd become common elsewhere. The modern world was happening somewhere, but not here, not yet. People would occasionally leave and come back changed, having seen how different life could be. Young men returning from military service, sailors who traveled to other ports, the occasional person who went to Athens for work and came back with stories and new perspectives. But mostly, these returning travelers would readjust to island life, slipping back into the old patterns, because what choice did they have? You can't bring modernity back to an island that doesn't have electricity or running water or any of the infrastructure that modernity requires. The oral culture reinforced this timelessness. When knowledge is passed down through stories and direct instruction, rather than written texts, it changes very slowly. The same stories are told the same way for generations. The same techniques for farming, fishing, cooking, building are passed from parent to child without innovation, because innovation is risky and unnecessary when the old ways work well enough. Even the language preserved older forms. The dialects spoken on remote islands retained words and pronunciations that had disappeared from mainland Greek. It was like linguistic time capsules, preserving speech patterns from centuries earlier. An educated person from Athens visiting these islands might have trouble understanding the local dialect, which was oddly satisfying to the islanders. Their language was proof of their authenticity, their connection to the past. The physical landscape itself was a kind of living history. The stone walls marking property boundaries had been built by ancestors dead for centuries. The old churches had frescoes painted by monks whose names were forgotten, but whose work remained. The olive trees were older than anyone's great-grandparents. Walking through these villages meant walking through layers of accumulated time. Even the stones in the streets were worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. You'd walk where your ancestors walked, quite literally in their footsteps. And there was something profound about that continuity, even if it was also a bit oppressive when you thought about how none of them had managed to escape either. The night sky, mentioned earlier, deserves another moment of attention. Looking up at the same stars that ancient Greek sailors had used for navigation, seeing the same constellations that had been named thousands of years ago, there was a direct connection to the deep past. The stars hadn't changed. The myths about them were still told. A shepherd in 1950, looking at Orion's belt, was seeing exactly what a shepherd in 950 AD saw, and what a shepherd in 950 BC saw. This sense of connection to the past was everywhere. When you baked bread using your grandmother's techniques, you were doing what women had done for thousands of years. When you fished using traditional methods, you were doing what your ancestors had done since ancient times. When you danced at festivals, you were moving your body in ways that might have recognizable roots in dances from the classical period, changed and evolved, but not fundamentally different. There's a strange comfort in that kind of continuity, even if it comes at the cost of progress and change. You're part of something larger than yourself, something that has survived wars, plagues, foreign occupations, famines, and will probably survive you too. Your individual struggles and joys are temporary, but the pattern continues. As the 20th century progressed, especially after World War II, things began to change more rapidly. Electricity arrived on many islands in the 1950s and 60s. Telephones, tight, better ferry service, television in the 1970s. Suddenly, these isolated communities were connected to the wider world in ways they'd never been before. News arrived instantly instead of weeks late. People could see how others lived, what they had, what was possible. The young people started leaving in larger numbers. Why stay on an island and work yourself to exhaustion for a subsistence living when you could go to Athens or Germany or Australia and have a modern life with modern conveniences and actual opportunities? The migration was steady at first, then became a flood. Villages that had been home to 500 people shrank to 100, then 50, then just the elderly who were too old or too stubborn to leave. The traditions began to fade, not disappear completely, but change and diminish. Weddings became smaller, less elaborate. Festivals attracted fewer people. The old skills, weaving, traditional fishing, making cheese in the old way, were less likely to be passed on because the young people weren't interested and weren't staying to learn anyway. Tourism discovered the islands in the 1960s and 70s, which brought money but also changed the character of the places. Suddenly, being traditional and picturesque was economically valuable. Tavernas appeared, catering to visitors who wanted authentic experiences. Houses were converted to rental rooms. The economy shifted from subsistence agriculture and fishing to service work catering to tourists. This created a weird dynamic where the old way of life was simultaneously dying out and being preserved as a kind of performance for visitors. The traditional dances were still done, but now partly for tourists with cameras. The old fishing boats were maintained partly because they looked good in photographs. The whole culture became self-conscious in a way it had never been before. By the 1980s and 90s, the transformation was largely complete on most islands. The villages still existed, but they were different. Electricity, phones, television, cars, modern plumbing. All the things that separated these places from modernity had mostly arrived. The old people who remembered how it used to be were dying off. Their children had mostly left. Their grandchildren visited in summer, treating the island as a vacation destination rather than home. Today, many of these villages are semi-deserted for most of the year, coming to life only in summer when the diaspora returns and tourists arrive. The old houses are renovated as vacation homes. The churches are maintained more for their historical value than for regular worship. The olive trees still produce, but often the harvest is left to foreign workers rather than local families. The oral traditions, the songs and stories and skills are being recorded by anthropologists and folklorists, preserved in archives and museums, which is good but also sad because it means they're being recognized as endangered. Things that were once living, breathing parts of daily life become artifacts, historical curiosities, proof of how people used to live. And yet, something persists. The landscape is still beautiful. The sea still glitters in the sun. The olive trees still grow, indifferent to economic changes and population decline. The churches still stand, even if fewer people attend services. The basic shape of the villages, the layout of streets and buildings, remains largely unchanged, even if the houses now have Wi-Fi. Some people, a small number, are trying to revive the old ways, at least partially. Young people who grew up in cities but feel disconnected and rootless, returning to their families' islands, trying to live more traditionally, making olive oil or cheese or wine using old methods. It's a very small movement, and it looks different than the old way of life. It's chosen rather than inevitable, conscious rather than unconscious, informed by modern knowledge rather than pure tradition. But there's something touching about these efforts, this desire to connect with a simpler, slower way of life, even if it's impossible to truly recreate it. You can't unknow the modern world. You can't pretend that alternatives don't exist. Living traditionally now is a choice, which fundamentally changes its nature. The old villagers didn't choose their way of life. It was simply the only option. That compulsory quality was both the strength and the tragedy of that existence. So, as we drift toward sleep here, thinking about these Greek island villages, what should we take away from this very long exploration of a very slow way of life? Maybe it's the reminder that for most of human history, for most people, life was local, repetitive, constrained by geography and tradition and limited resources. The kind of mobility and choice we take for granted now is historically very recent and still not available to everyone. Maybe it's an appreciation for the resilience of people who made do with so little, who found meaning and joy in lives that from the outside might look desperately limited, who built communities and raised families and passed on their culture despite poverty and hardship and the grinding sameness of each day. Maybe it's a critique of that same life, recognition that the stability and tradition came at a cost, lack of freedom, especially for women, little opportunity for individual expression or deviation from norms, the suffocating weight of social expectations and gossip, the way poverty and isolation could trap people in cycles of suffering. Or maybe it's just interesting to think about how different life was, how the pace and rhythm and texture of daily existence in these villages was so far removed from our modern experience that it might as well be a different planet. And yet, the people were fundamentally like us, worrying about their families, trying to get by, finding small pleasures, dealing with difficult personalities, falling in love and arguing and laughing and crying and eventually dying, just like everyone everywhere always has. The sun sets on this topic as it set on those island villages every evening, slowly, beautifully, inevitably. The day ends. The cycle continues. Tomorrow will be much like today, and we can find either comfort or horror in that thought, or probably some mix of both. So that's our long, slow journey through Greek island village life. I hope it helped you relax, maybe drift off to sleep, maybe think differently about time and place and tradition. These villages existed, these lives were lived, and while that particular way of life is mostly gone now, it shaped the people who lived it and their descendants in ways both obvious and subtle. And now, if you're still awake somehow after all of this, feel free to let yourself drift off. Think about the sound of the sea, the smell of olive oil and oregano, the warmth of the sun on old stone, the slow passage of days into years, into generations. Let it all blend together into a peaceful, drowsy meditation on time and place and the endless small details that make up a human life. Sleep well. Now, the goats will still be there tomorrow, having their opinions. The bread will still need to be made. The olive trees will still be growing, indifferently, beautifully, older than anyone's memory. And that's somehow both sad and reassuring at the same time. Good night.